Thank you very much, Andrea, and also to all the organizers. I want to begin by underscoring what Deb just told us about this meeting. And I want to acknowledge what these organizers have accomplished before we've even started. And I'll do that using the words of Megan O'Rourke, whom many of you may know, but at the time that I'm referring to, she was a program leader at NIFA, actually still is, but she's on detail in Congress right now. And I got hold of her and asked her whether she had any thoughts, knowing that this meeting is now actually taking place, an idea that had been proposed to her, as we've just heard, about 2 years ago. And she did have a couple of thoughts. And so let me just read them to you. She said, the first thing is that new initiatives take time, but we can move the needle slowly. And secondly, she said, I've been thinking about how people at the table largely set the norms and lead to outcomes, whether we like to acknowledge that in science or not. And so that's the thing that's been accomplished so far before we started out. This does not look like the crowd that I typically find at academic meetings. And it's very appropriate that for those of us who want to advocate for agroecology as a different conception of the food and agriculture system, that we actually embody and practice that in terms of who we bring to the table. Having said that, all that we've done is literally set the table. We will have to test whether we're actually going to be able to overcome the conventions of these sorts of meetings as we proceed. More than one person in the statements from panelists that you all received noted that academics are notorious for having a lack of humility. And so we're here, among other things, to test the proposition that these less than humble academics are actually able to have genuine human conversations with people that have different experience and different credentials to be entering into the conversation that we're here to have over the next 3 days. But I do want to acknowledge that it is an accomplishment that we look like a different group that's going to venture into blue skying about the future of agroecology. And that's what I understand the remit to be. It's really humbling for me to be asked to speak first at an event where, as I look out across the crowd and at the table to my left here, I see the teachers that have taught me everything that I know about this particular topic. So this is not really a very promising premise. I have nothing new to say to anybody in this group, and I want to acknowledge that. But we have been asked to think about the future. So whereas we might affirm one another, as you've seen in the statements from panelists in terms of the broad contours of our worldview and our analysis, we're not here to spend time on that. Given everything that has brought us to this room, what can we do to bring a different reality in food and agricultural systems to be in the future? So I want to join you in an exercise in blue skying in just one dimension. We'll pick at this in lots of different ways over the next few days. Let me talk to you a little bit about how I think of the challenge at, quote, Advancing Agroecology in the USA. That's the title for this particular evening's session. It is primarily that in this room, we are a small band of true believers. We really think we're right. We're adamant about that, and we're exasperated about the fact that the majority of the world doesn't even know what we're talking about when we say the word agroecology, that we need to explain ourselves. And so I think it's good for us to remember that the adherents of industrial agriculture are also true believers. The same thing can be said about them. And our difficulty is that we are on the margins of that world. They are the folks that have created and own and operate the entrenched system. And so that's reflected in all the ways that panelists have highlighted in the various statements, that we tend to be small in number, that in academia it's very difficult for us to get respectability, that the funding that's devoted to our work is trivial compared to the funding that goes to the mainstream. So all of this is expected. So that's the challenge that we have. And we can't stake transformational change on our ability to find a clever way to finesse the dynamics of that entrenched system. That's not something that we can accomplish here in a few days. Instead, what I want to propose is that the basis on which agroecological approaches will eventually become adopted is that they are better than the approaches of the entrenched system. And that is what we need to make clear for everyone to see. This needs to be understood in more ways than just, quote, communications or propaganda or indoctrination. It actually needs to be felt by everyone with a stake in the food and agricultural system in a way that is meaningful to them. And as Andrea wrote in her panelist statement, that's all of us. That includes all of us. So, remembering that the Food and Agriculture Project is a social undertaking, I mentioned that you all are my teachers, and that's one of the biggest learnings I've gleaned from Stephen's writing, that the ultimate conception of agroecology is basically the realization that the food and agricultural system is a social undertaking. It reflects the values of the society. So if we remember that, we should formulate the sequence of community action, of public policy, of academic research, and the practice of food and agriculture systems accordingly. Those are some of the major factors that create the contours of the food and agriculture system. So let me try to drill down into that idea. Tim Cruz, in his panelist statement, asked us to answer very specific questions about the food and agriculture systems 50 years from now. So for instance, do we imagine that it's basically the same system, but instead of using fossil fuels, now we're electrified? But we continue to eat the same stuff. The extent of the agricultural footprint is pretty much the same thing. It's a slightly less bad agricultural system. So he asked us to think very carefully about those sorts of questions before we start to plot a course to get there. So Jahi Chappell, in his panelist statement, reminded us of the value of this kind of exercise projecting into the future by quoting Park Troutman, who said, "It's better to ask where you want to go and to work backward to figure out what it would take to get there." Because, as Jahi explained, otherwise we'll choose the things that are comfortable and easy for us to do right now, the things that we can imagine can be done, without too much effort, without too much embarrassment, without too much loss of professional face. And so that's the significance of this particular exercise. So, for example, if in 2073 it is the case that food and agriculture systems of that era have been specified collectively by all the stakeholders in the system, per the principles of deciding who's in this room right now, we bring in everybody that has something to say about this, then what kind of fora and social infrastructure has to be created first to enable the kinds of dialogue needed by those of us here today who have such disparate views and understanding of how food and agriculture should work? And what I mean by those of us here today, it's not just those of us here in this room. Remember, we're on the margins. But everybody who believes that they understand and are driving and are responsible for the way in which the food and agriculture system operates. With such different views of it, what are the avenues whereby we can speak to each other and actually elevate different ways of doing things, because it is evident that the system that we have in place is not going to abate the negatives of the present system. So if there's a way that we can talk about that, then we need to start building that social infrastructure. So to avoid the distortions that are due to specialization, can we imagine the following situations? Imagine a setting in the Central Valley of California, in the Diné Nation and other native reservations, or in currently hollowed out rural communities in the Midwest, in the South, in Appalachia, where community members, academics, government officials vision their goals jointly, where they question assumptions, statements that are just made out of academic authority, where they make their constraints explicit. In other words, yes, I agree with that goal, but it should not come at the cost of dirty water, or that I can't recreate in my own community. We should set up governance systems for long-term socioeconomic projects that properly locate knowledge generation in the various forms that it can take, not just the traditional academic approaches, in such a way that they serve the goals of interest and interests of all people. Can you imagine that sort of setting? If you can imagine that sort of setting, if you think that that would be better than the way that we come up with answers to those questions now in isolation, then we need to begin to work to create that reality today. So let's begin to speak in this way. In other words, we should begin to reject strictly academic or strictly reductionist visions of the future based on the success of particular technologies. For instance, we should call out that that's a way of having an incomplete conversation. We should also organize in this way. We should generate projects and proposals in this way. We should evaluate the effectiveness and the validity of agroecological projects in this way. In other words, jointly. not by the primacy of specialists. By the way, this can also help us to meet the objective of countering industrial agricultural propaganda. Because while individual agribusinesses with their massive marketing budgets and or individual scientists, with their list of credentials, can crow about production trends in tons per hectare, the moment that all community voices are heard and can influence the social choices, which after all are what public policies and research funding actually are, the cost of the megatons per hectare in broken communities, in degraded soil, in warming climate, in polluted water, in chronic disease, in economic inequality, cannot be hidden or partitioned away as neatly as they are today. So this is going to require rethinking the way that knowledge inquiry is understood and framed. I personally would love to see the world that results when groups in areas like the ones I listed earlier, I'll just repeat so we can imagine it, the Central Valley of California, the Dene Nation and other native reservations, or currently hollowed out rural communities in the Midwest, the South, and Appalachia, where the community groups are the POs, the project overseers, instead of the PIs, the principal investigators, where technologists, policy analysts, and policymakers play a role in service to a collectively determined objective. Here I'm going to ask you for a little bit of personal license. In native communities, like the one that I was brought in, that's how all major community decisions are made to this day. You don't get to make decisions that are going to affect the entire community as just a single individual. They need to be worked out by the community. So that is also how all final outcomes, whether foreseen or surprises of a particular project, are finally evaluated, with each assessment being the point of departure for a subsequent iteration. So in this community, just to give you an idea, if you wonder what that is about, is the decision whether to allow the branch of a bank to be built in the town, or the decision whether the 3-mile road down to the river should be paved or whether it should remain a dirt road, discussing all the pros and cons. Those are the sorts of things that I'm referring to. So, as I mentioned earlier, we should adopt ideas and strategies because they work. And we should reject and learn from those that do not. But the definition of what works and what does not work needs to be developed in that collective sense, where lots of different ways of seeing the world are actually included in the definition of a project. So the process that I just described to you has served my particular community. It's a little town, 700 people in the Sierra Juárez of Oaxaca, in today's Mexico, colonized area, since at least 700 AD, according to what the archaeologists tell us. That's 1,300 years. So I'll stake the bets that we make for the world that we want in 50 years on that kind of a process. That village is still there. Even the most fanatical adherents of industrial agriculture and the petroleum economy couldn't make a similar claim about the future in 1,300 years, because the process is not there. Instead, what they ask us to do is to have blind faith in short-term technology and not to think about the future, not to think responsibly about the future. So the agroecologically informed and responsible way to approach the situation is to begin to work now, to create the world that will be good for all of us. And it is not going to be technology dependent. It's going to be trust dependent. It's going to be community based. It's going to begin with groups like this. Thank you.
All right. So I'm Deb Neher from University of Vermont, where I currently live, but I know some of you probably have never met me before, so I thought I'd just give you a little bit of background in context how I got into agroecology, mostly for some historical perspective too. So I grew up 4th generation family farm in northwest Kansas, so it's about 350 miles west of here. My ancestry is German, and my culture was Anabaptist. I went to McPherson College for my undergraduate degree, is where I first had an agroecology course in about 1981. That was a required course for my environmental science major, and that was an eye-opener. And I also took had a course in Guatemala in January 1981, and if you remember the history, that was a pretty rough period. I was there when Reagan came into office, so quite violent time. And I also was introduced by my advisor to the Land Institute. And the Land Institute was really inspirational to me for professional pursuits in agroecology and soil ecology. My experience in Guatemala on this course in rural development was really a life changer for me. It really opened my eyes about the need for education here in the United States. A lot of ignorance here in the United States. During my master's at University of Illinois, I learned about New Ag. And many people probably haven't even heard of New Ag before, but I know there are people in this room that do. That stands for New World Agriculture Group. And this is where I learned about people like John Vandermeer and Yvette Perfecto and Steve Gleesman. And for those of you that aren't familiar, New Ag has a focus on Latin America. So what are the aspirations as I see them, and what do we hope to accomplish today? One of my big motivators was this is an opportunity to really strengthen our voice as through listening to diverse perspectives and identifying common ground among us and understanding areas of divergence. Agroecologists have been scattered about among different conferences, disciplines, different departments, even in academics. We get academics separated from practitioners, and applied science gets valued less than basic science. So this is an opportunity for us to come together and converse, to find common ground. I think it's a first in the history to bring this many agroecologists into one space in the United States. We can identify team players for future projects, prioritize, brainstorm, dream, and envision. Just a little bit of history on societies. My colleague Steve Gleesman and I, in 2000, the year 2000, we prepared a proposal to launch an agroecology chapter in the Ecological Society of America. And today that section has grown to 277 members. I think we probably started out with a dozen or two. But, you know, the significance was this legitimized agriculture as an honest ecosystem within ecology. It was always pushed aside before. Now that agroecosystems, there's this agroecosystem subject tract in the society journal called Ecospheres, and it's edited by agroecologists. And I know at least one of those editors is in this room. Agroecology is also represented in the Agronomy Society of America through two different sections, through global agronomy and through the agroeconomic production systems. So another is, I think one opportunity I see is for us to work to improve legislation. That's a goal for leveraging funding, to increase funding for all aspects of agroecology, practice, movement, and research. And it's an opportunity to begin to develop strategies to help educate the public of our vision and articulate, help write, research proposals to help funders draft those, come up with policy briefs, and generally to try to increase funding that serves a more general public mission. So what's my big, bold, long-term vision for this? Here are a few of those topics. One is, I think we really need to shift our thinking away from an extractive economy to working with and according to nature. And I know Tim Cruz will be talking more about this kind of model. We need nature as our model. Part of this, too, is to be working in systems that have reduced input and less fertility in them. And thinking about these as being specific to geographies and ecosystem types. One thing I've learned through my career is the problems of applying too much nitrogen. There's so many consequences, a couple of which are it really aggravates and increases plant diseases. Pathogens love nitrogen, and it pollutes our water. And another thing is that we really need to learn more about the science behind proven models. Second big one is we really, and this is a lofty one, and I don't know how to do it, but we need a shift in our economic paradigm so that we have more value placed on natural resources, and that includes values that transcend into business models and provide incentives to conserve and restore these resources. We know monetary value garners respect, and if it can be thrown away and disappears from accounting books, then people forget about it. And we also need some decentralization so that we can recognize strength and scale diversity from small, medium, and large rather than one size fits all. Less centralization helps save on fossil fuels. It's an opportunity to, have more local varieties that are tastier, more nutritious, fresher, and also increases in employment and market opportunities when we have a more localized food chain. I want to make sure and get across some terminology. We talk about transdisciplinarity, but I want to make sure that we understand the difference between multi, inter, and transdisciplinarity. These terms sometimes get used interchangeably. So transdisciplinarity, I think, is our goal. It's really a problem-solving approach. Multidisciplines is when everybody works on a common problem but keeps in their own silos of their boundaries of their own disciplines. Interdisciplinary is when everybody's working on the same problem with overlapping disciplinary boundaries, blending of assumptions and restrictions. And you start to get some collaboration that yields co-creative innovation. But transdisciplinarity, you start to blur those boundaries of discipline. You work together on the same problem by transcending those disciplinary boundaries, drawing on non-traditional approaches. You cross-fertilize assumptions and restrictions that help resolve contradictory points of view and outcomes that have practical solutions to problems. And this is where the innovation really can occur. So I'll end with this slide on a couple priorities I think we have in terms of research that could have a positive impact on pressing food system problems. One is related to crop breeding for systems with lower mineral nutrients, but yet we can maintain or increase the nutrient content of the crops, and also to study disease management under these less fertile systems, and to have more reliance on food production that is native or adapted to its geography rather than trying to alter the environment to fit the crop. Get the crop to fit the environment. Thank you.
Well, it's quite an honor to be here and see this group of agroecologists. Thinking back, we had to name ourselves agroecologists because nobody would do it for us. and look at you. This is pretty amazing. I want to, again, kind of like Deb did, do a little history. I don't know if it's personal history or if it's the history that I've been swept along in personally around agroecology, but it began really with this agroecosystem concept that we throw around now, and just like it's been around forever. But I remember when it was first proposed by people like Dan Jansen and Aubrey Lukes. They said, hey, we got to think about farms as ecosystems as well, without really understanding how we were going to make that meaningful. And then people like Hernández Cholocoche in Mexico that really worked on the Agroecosistemas de Mexico and really brought the people piece into it, the connection between the environment and culture that concept meant for everybody. And I got the opportunity to spend several years at a small school of tropical agriculture in southern Mexico. And we didn't know how to take this agroecosystem concept and study it as ecologists. It was a small group of ecologists in a school of agriculture in the tropics in the time of the Green Revolution being tested. And so we called it Agroecology, for want of a better word. And at the same time, the journal Agroecosystems came out, published by Elsevier, and it was 7 years with that term. And one thing I always try to do as an editor is get rid of that hyphen between agro and ecosystems. Shouldn't be there. And that time in the southern part of Mexico, when Green Revolution was really being tested by CIMMYT, by the big companies that were behind CIMMYT, around us was this traditional agriculture and farmers who were willing to share their knowledge and teach us what they knew, and we could share what we knew. And out of that, came the first edition of the textbook, Agroecology, focused on ecological processes in sustainable agriculture, pretty much farm-based. And we came up with those first 3 levels of transition, in this case, conversion, thinking about converting a food system from one way of designing and managing it to another, substituting inputs, trying to redesign that system, but pretty much on the farm level. And I really was honored that Gene Odom wrote the preface for that book. Because I remember in 1984, when I was visiting him in Georgia, he said, there needs to be a textbook of agroecology. He pushed me into it, and I talked him into doing the foreword, which I'm very proud of. And focusing some of that initial 3-level work on strawberries, methyl bromide, when it was still being allowed to be used, so you could farm strawberries year after year after year on the same piece of ground. And a farmer telling me the only thing you need the soil for is to hold the plant up. I'll put in the rest. Well, that has obviously changed considerably. But things really shifted for me when Chuck Francis and the group came out with an article in 2003 on agroecology as the ecology of the whole food system. And that's when Roy Poncelat passed the Journal of Sustainable Agriculture onto me in 2007. And the combination of both of those approaches and that kind of thinking led to the second edition of the book in 2007, where we changed the title of the book from the Ecology of Sustainable Agriculture to the Ecology of Sustainable Food Systems, knowing very well that we had to add another level in the whole process of now not just converting a system, but transitioning a whole food system to that better system that Ricardo mentioned. And a lot of that was through reconnecting the 2 most important parts of the food system, the people who grow the food and the people who eat the food. And to have Chuck Francis write the foreword for me in that book, again, was an honor. Another one of my teachers, to say the least. And then going on even further, as we looked down from above, as drones started to become something we could see the landscape, how it was distributed, how it changed, and did a 3rd edition in 2015 and brought in a 5th level. And in this case, not a conversion, not a transition, but now we're really talking about transformation. A full redesign, a full shift, a shift in paradigm, where, we really think, again, beyond just the productivist approach to food systems. And here, one of my teachers wrote the foreword, Ricardo. Thank you so much. And I'm just honored the way that agroecology has just swept me along through all these years. And now, we changed the name of the Journal of Sustainable Agriculture to Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems in 2013, and really talking about food justice, equity, fairness, access, all of the parts of the social side of the food system that, as Deb said, get compartmentalized and hidden away, and we don't really deal with them. And in that year, I opened up and realized, you know, this is probably the last edition I'm going to work on. I'm worn out, huh? And brought in some young blood to the process and changed the subtitle even more to Leading the Transformation to a Just and Sustainable Food Systems. And that is what agroecology has responsibility for doing, leading that transformation. And agroecology, you know, really brings in the co-learning, the participatory process, you know, that brings sovereignty, that brings food security and resilience to all parts of the food systems. So that's, to me, such an important piece. And we talk about, you know, agroecology as a science. And there are a bunch of you here who are scientists. But it's also a practice. It's a way of doing food production, doing the processing and distribution of food, of improving the food system. But it's also a process of social change. And I've always believed that what the key thing, and I go back to Rich Merrill in his book, Radical Agriculture, 1976, when he said, our main goal is to get culture back into agriculture. So it's really all three. We need to have all three. And I've been really fortunate and lucky in my years to have been able to be involved in all three. You know, not just a scientist, but a farmer and an activist, really pushing for change, for this transformative process. And I'm still doing it, yeah, in lots of different ways. And the foreword for the 4th edition that came out last year was Yvette and John. Another great honor to me to have them do that. As I think back, 1969 in Costa Rica, oh boy, lots of things. So I've been able to carry this into our family farm, this little 5-acre wine, grape, and olive operation, dry farmed, organically certified, local markets, all of the things that for me represent that better form of food systems design and management. And all I can do today is sort of offer a virtual toast to all of you, but pretty proud of our products with Robbie and myself, my wife, and now as we look forward to what our work is ahead, the next generations are the ones who are really going to put into process this transformative work that we have to do. And it just makes me excited and hopeful, which I guess is part of why our little farm is called Condor's Hope. But that's a whole nother story. But it's in your hands, especially the younger members of our group here today. And I'll end just with this photo of my grandson. He's the next generation. Thank you all for being here, and I'm really, really proud to be part of this movement. Thank you.
Boy, hard to follow Steve Gleesman. I was asked to talk about the context for advancing agroecology, and my first thought was to reiterate all the problems with our food system, but that's too dispiriting, and you folks really don't need to hear that. You know that all too well. This food system has been created intentionally and perpetuated by U.S. policies that promote research and development of agrochemicals and technology that's most suitable on the largest farms. Policies also allow the continuing concentration of mega agribusinesses by very limited implementation of antitrust law and financialization and speculation on land and food. The consequences have been terrible for the environment, for small-scale and mid-scale farmers, for people of color, for public health, and for rural communities. But this is the context in which agroecology is emerging in the United States. But it's well established in other countries around the world, from rapidly increasing organic acreage in Australia and European countries to an explosion of agroecological farms in Latin America, to Andhra Pradesh's wholesale conversion to natural farming. And we can debate whether all this is truly transformative agroecology. Agroecology is promoting both a more rational approach to nourishing humans than the dominant industrialized food system in the United States. I agree completely with Ricardo that it's simply a better system, because the system that we have is destroying ecosystems, community vitality, and public health. But it's also a visionary reorientation of values in the food system. Agroecology recognizes human interdependence with nature and the necessity of respecting and protecting the non-human world in which all human life depends, not as ecosystem services that can be monetized and exploited as carbon offsets, but as a living entity that supports food production, pollination, nutrient cycling, breakdown of waste products, and many other free goods that simply can't be replaced with technology. This values base is rooted in indigenous perspectives, which have frequently upheld an approach to food production and consumption that incorporates culture. They don't have any problem with agriculture. It incorporates culture, spirituality, and the understanding that people are intimately connected with animals, plants, and land. The specific practices used in fields and in marine systems arise from farmers and fishing peoples' long-running experiments around the world that have been evaluated with scientific approaches. The context for agroecology in the United States is, writ large, the encroachment of capitalist exploitation of people and commons into every sphere of life. This has been supported by the U.S. government and its corporate allies for private profit through aggressive lobbying, donations to politicians, industry-supported research. I was on a panel with Gerardo Otero just recently, and he calls it mercenary science. Industry-supported research and the squelching of research that doesn't support industry lines, and the intrusion into food system governance spaces that should be controlled democratically in the public interest in the vision that Ricardo laid out for us. As several other speakers in this session commented in their introductory summaries, the science of agroecology has lagged behind practices and the impetus that social movements are providing. This is not surprising, given the paltry funding that agroecological research has received in contrast with industrialized agriculture. We see that agroecological practices work, but we understand far too little about why they work and the limits of their application in different soil types and scales. Even more importantly, we don't know how to best encourage the rapid massification of agroecology among farmers and a public that's been told all their lives by agrochemical companies and the farm press that there's no alternative to industrialized agriculture, given anticipated population growth. We grow enough food. Oh, you're going to take that off? Okay. We grow enough food already for more than 10 billion people, but it isn't getting to the hungriest people. The mantra that U.S. farmers must feed the world is nonsense. We don't feed the world. Apart from some grains provided as humanitarian aid, our exports feed livestock, and in many cases, such as in Mexico, undercut local agriculture by selling subsidized grains and beef below the cost of production. I anticipate that the participants in this summit will identify core research themes that will be picked up and supported by USDA in new funding for projects to evaluate and improve food production, marketing, and dietary diversity through agroecology. I hope that USDA will be able to reorient its current advocacy for, quote, climate-smart agriculture and the spread of industrialized agriculture worldwide into support for the wider and deeper concepts and practices of agroecology, which are, of course, climate-smart, but so much more, biodiversity-smart, diet-smart, water-smart, etc. I hope that USDA can promote diversification and perennialization of production systems and breaking our addiction to fossil fuels throughout the food system, from the production of nitrogen fertilizers to global trade of goods. And I hope that USDA can begin to subsidize new agroecological markets where customers can buy healthy, diverse food produced nearby without agrochemicals. USDA support could help new researchers enter the field to analyze and grow agroecology. It might encourage more participatory research focused on farmers' issues. It could also help to overcome negative assumptions about agroecology, which are still all too prevalent. The Global Alliance for the Future of Food report on the politics of knowledge, understanding the evidence for agroecology, regenerative agriculture, and indigenous foodways, which I hope all of you have read, deals with many of these assumptions, such as that agroecology has low yields and is only suitable for small acreages. The report examines 5 big assumptions and provides factual data showing the tremendous potential of agroecology. Research on agroecology will continue whether it receives USDA funding or not, but the longer the U.S. delays support for agroecology, the farther out of step we will fall from the rest of the world and the vital need for food systems that preserve ecosystems, sequester carbon, reduce fossil fuel use, and truly nourish people. I want to thank the organizers who've worked so hard to bring together a diverse group of participants in this beautiful place, diverse in age, experience, institutional settings, and ethnicity. I think this is the right group to engage constructively to build an agenda for the research that's needed in the U.S. food system, and I personally am really excited to start. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Raj Patel. I am Jahi Chappelle's stunt double. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to fill Jahi's shoes and make you regret it almost immediately, because I mean, obviously you can feel this nervous energy up here. I'm suffering imposter syndrome even more than I normally do because I don't know what agroecology is, but I'm in the right place, and I just want a quick, I just want to sort of wake you up exercise. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to shout out a number, and you're not allowed to look at anyone else, you're not allowed to write it down. I want you to shout out the number of dimensions that agroecology has. How many dimensions does agroecology has? Do not confer. Do not look at anyone. Do not cite your own paper unless you have a paper. There are a couple of you, and you can cite your own paper. Okay, on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. Thank Christ. Okay, good. This is very reassuring that there is a wide variety of numbers that y'all shouted out, and that's healthy. That also makes me feel like maybe I'm okay in not knowing exactly what that number is myself. But I also think that that's, you know, the variation that we have in our understandings of agroecology can provide useful friction. I've got 2 points to make. One, just sort of, I was prompted to think about it just reading the sort of abstract for being here and seeing that we were here to look at agroecology in the USA to find out how many times to find out the ways in which we can really help the USA thrive, and this would therefore sort of really inspire the USA. And when I hear USA 3 times, I kind of reach for my gun. I worry about parochialism in the US left in general, and then I worry a lot about parochialism among us. Now, I understand that the USDA is giving us money, and so we have to genuflect in the ways that we must, but we don't have to, actually. And it would be good science. And so this is the first point I want to make, is that the way that agroecology constitutes itself through as movement, practice, and science is just science. And I want to make that idea, this is not to say there aren't movements, in fact, we're going to get to all of this, but I think one of the sort of cornerstones of science is peer review. One of the problems with capitalist and colonial science has been a vast exclusion of who counts as a peer. Who gets to know things? Is it that people of color get to know things? Is it that the workers on the ground get to know things? Is it that the plants get to teach us? Obviously, First Nations and indigenous communities, their knowledge has been stolen, but then they've not been allowed to know. And so the idea of a better agroecological science is, in fact, a process of mobilizing and recognizing that we need more peers around the table. And those peers are not, that table is on rematriated land. And that table, around that table, are not just scientists in the traditional sort of colonial sense, but also other folk, other beings, not just workers, but more than human people. And I think that idea matters because then all of a sudden we would be part of an international sort of moment in science. We've heard so many examples already from my teachers here of how agroecology is doing great stuff elsewhere in the world, and why aren't we doing it? And if we have proper peer review, hopefully we get to ask a different and better question, which is, what do we in the US owe the world? As agroecologists here, we may feel powerless, but the fact is we're in a country that is immensely wealthy through imperialism and colonialism, and we owe people stuff. Asking that question in a table that's a table that's about peer review is a table that I want to be around, and I sense y'all do too, and I'm excited about that dimension of agroecology. The second thing I want to just noodle on is this question of what works. The word work has just cropped up a lot, and I like it. I like that we're thinking about whose labor goes into the land. I like it that we're aware that agroecology, without, if other things are not changed, involves a gendered division of labor, that it requires more women's work. It requires more work from the working class. And that's important because if we are to have a demonstration of what works, then workers need to be part of the story. The only way that food systems have changed is through crisis. I was reading W.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction recently. He begins with, in fact, very much in the way that Ricardo did, saying his note to the reader at the beginning of Black Reconstruction is, I want you to, I'm assuming that my reader is a decent human person. He just begins with the idea that, actually, you know what, I'm just assuming that you are a peer, that you are equal. And he talks there, again, he takes humans very seriously. He takes the idea that after Reconstruction, people could transform the land that they were given. The 40 acres was very briefly a moment of transformative hope, and that workers could refashion an agroecological system. And crisis, the moment of the Civil War's moment of crisis offered a moment for the US to transform its agroecological system. Of course, that didn't last very long. But crisis is the only way that capital has transformed itself. Good evidence is insufficient. And this is, this is Ricardo's point, right? What works matters in the broader context of agroecology as counter-hegemony. Agroecology can't just succeed by having paper after paper saying, this is fucking great, because it is. But that's not how you build counter-hegemony. You build counter-hegemony through through organizing with blocks of workers and certain members of the middle class to be able to transform society. And I'm really excited about that idea of agroecology as counter-hegemony, and I'm excited about being in conversation with folk who have the dirt under their fingernails, and folk who understand what it is to precipitate crisis for capitalists, because that, it seems to me, is the way that we change culture, that we change our relationships to one another, and to the web of life. Thanks very much indeed.